So I was going to ask you to tell me about Oscar, because you never really have. Sorry to go for a biggie. But,
Wow.
I mean, just anything that comes to mind, how you met, what you remember, you know?
Well, I'll tell you and then I'll fill in.
Okay.
I was 19, 20, and I was working for the U.S. Information Agency, which is USIS, which is now USIA, and it was part of the American Embassy. And the reason I got that job is because of Dr. Brown, who is the person who Issy had a crush on, and he had a crush on her, so I got that job. And he was cultural attaché, and I was the receptionist. And
Dr. Brown was the
Dr. Brown was the attaché. And there's a whole other story about that, but that's another time. So anyway, I went to, I was very cute, and wore lots of eye makeup. And then I was in the elevator going up to work, and I saw this man who was dressed. He was so amazing. I mean, he looked European. And he was in the elevator, and he said, "I would love to photograph your eyes." And he was working
was he a photographer?
No, he worked for McCann Erickson, which is a big, McCann Erickson is one of the top advertising agencies. But he worked in that agency in Mexico, but they were opening an agency in Guatemala, and he came as art director. And they took the whole beer, contract, or whatever you call it. So he said he wanted to do a photograph of my eyes for Nesti, which one of you has that, or maybe it's lost. And I said, sure, but I was fascinated by him. I said, whoa.
Why were you fascinated by him?
The way he dressed and the way he carried himself, and he looked like Alain Delon. But, you know, he looked like an older man with a lot of money, which he probably didn't have. Well, he did have an Alfa Romeo, though. The TI, which was a small Sportster.
Was he good looking?
In my eyes, I don't know if anybody else thought he was, but he was interesting looking. There was some charisma about him that I liked.
But it was more personality, though.
It was personality. Yeah, I never go for the looks, like beautiful looks. I always like something that sparks something. So anyway, he took my photo, and then he took me to lunch, and then and I was a virgin. I had never slept with anybody. And not even Paul Winter, who I was with in New York in Harlem in an apartment. But that's another story. And I never slept with him. And anyway, so we went to lunch and we went to dinner, and then this and that, and then he had an apartment in town, and I won't go into any details, but he seduced me. And he said that he was separated.
Were you sort of in love with him, or were you?
Oh my gosh, I was balled over. And he said that he was divorced and that he was trying to make a life in Guatemala. And my mother loved him. He just charmed the pants off of her. And he was so nice to her and kind, and he was real witty. He had a Mexican kind of humor, kind of a Chicano kind of humor. And she just loved that. And so I can't remember, he left, and then I was going to New York because I got a job at the United Nations. Well, I had an interview in the United Nations to be a guide, and I got that through the embassy. And I wrote a letter, and they said, come in September. New York, which I wanted to live there because I had seen Breakfast at Tiffany's, and I wanted to be like her.
Of course.
And that's why I went after Paul Winter, because I wanted to be Holly Golightly. And I was, but I wasn't. You know, my mother was very weird and very, she she was a jazz fanatic, and I grew up listening to jazz, the best jazz in the world. But anyway, so I went to, I was on my way to New York, and I stopped in Mexico just to see what that was all about. I stayed with a family that I knew, and then I called Oscar, and he said, well, I'm leaving Guatemala because you're not here anymore. So why don't you fly back to Guatemala, get in my car, and we'll drive back to Mexico together. I mean, here I am, 21, 22.
Yeah.
And
So
I jumped in a plane, never got to New York, canceled New York, went back to Guatemala, and he didn't know I was there. And then I went to Mexico.
yeah.
And I call it my Acapulco nights because that's when I think Alex was conceived, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
There's a lot more stuff in between.
Yeah, but maybe you're skipping the fun stuff.
Well,
I mean,
the first
insofar as,
stuff
like, what
is
was
that I was so hungry in Mexico. I was hungry. I stayed in Mexico and lived for 2 years.
Yeah.
And I had no money. And he was married. And he ended up telling me he was married. He just couldn't get out of the situation. And I'm sorry, but I'm going to get an apartment. And I had this little teeny apartment, a studio in Mexico. He was paying for that. But then I didn't have a lot of money to spend. So and I didn't know how to cook at all. And one time he bought me some spaghetti, and I put it into cold water and then turned the water on. So the whole thing was... Anyway, it was a sad time because I got very thin, and I got very, if I would have one egg, I would save it for the morning because I knew I'd be hungrier in the morning.
Wow.
I mean, I could fry an egg.
Did you have friends then?
I did meet a couple of friends, and a friend from Guatemala, and some other family friends, girls and guys, but they were all friends. But he was so jealous that he wouldn't let me see anybody.
Wow. So what were you thinking? Were you thinking I got to get out of this thing, or were you kind of just hoping it would work?
I was fascinated by him, and I couldn't let go. I didn't know how to let go.
Yeah.
And the only reason I let go is because I got pregnant with Alex.
Well, so how did you end it with?
Okay, so
Did you just
anyway,
leave town?
I came back to...
Or did you...
Oh, I was evil. So anyway, I came back to Guatemala, and Tita was very upset that I was pregnant. So we made up a story because in those days you weren't supposed to be. So I had Alex. Hi, darling. You came to us because you missed us. And guess what? I had Papa Bill, although it's not the best. Turn it up.
No, you can finish.
No. So anyway, I had... No. I'm telling you about Alex and Oscar. So you can hear it.
She's just finishing. She's in the last minute of this.
Where was that?
I was just asking how you came back to Guatemala.
So I came back to Guatemala and I was pregnant.
What, he's expecting you to go back?
So, no. Then he moved to San Salvador to be closer to me. And I moved to San Salvador and I didn't like it because I opened this door and an iguana came out underneath my bed. And it freaked me out. So I decided to move back home. And the ending of my story is very sad because I had Alex, and Alex was 2 years old, and then I met Angelo. It was probably one of the lucks of my life. I've had 3. And I met Angelo, and I left Oscar. But he was married.
Yeah, of course. How did you tell him? Did you write him a letter? Did you just leave?
He came over to Guatemala, and he said, well, are you going to come back? And he said, no, I'm not going back.
Wow. Was he upset?
Yeah, but not really upset because he already was with a Salvadoreña woman, and he had another daughter, and Alex has a sister called Paula,